Good evening. It is Saturday, May the 28th, about 9:30 p.m. This is Shay Gibson with Weather Flow and Wind Alert, giving you a tropics update on Tropical Storm Bonnie, which was given the name this afternoon by the National Hurricane Center. And now at 7:43 p.m. for the update, or for the 8 p.m. update, technically, Tropical Storm Bonnie is holding winds of 40 miles an hour near the center, with pressure down to 1,007 millibars. So not very much of a drop from last night at 1,009 to only 1,007. And we have anticipated this system as remaining a weak tropical storm at best, or subtropical storm at best, and it looks like it's going to remain that way as this storm is nearly stationary over the Gulf Stream right now and will start to drift off to the northwest and ultimately north-northwest to just south of Charleston. So if we look at the track for this, let's take a look at the Datascope storm track that we have, and it looks like just south of Charleston, if we zoom into the area, we get a better idea of where the focal point is going to be for the coast. And it looks like earlier it was around Edisto Island, and now it looks like it's still Edisto Beach area for this system, for the central low pressure to move across this vicinity. Now it looks like the timeline here to push inland would be 2 o'clock p.m. tomorrow, so that means we're looking at a possible landfall for this center of low pressure, or the tropical storm center, to make its way on shore by morning hours to mid to late morning hours. So that's kind of the gist of what we think. Now if we look at some of the winds in the area right now, we see a tightened gradient, especially offshore. We have 21 knots with 31 knot gusts offshore at the Capers nearshore buoy. We're showing Fripp nearshore at 23, gusting to 29. Down in Tybee Island earlier, we had gusting up to 37 knots. So that was tropical storm force winds well outside of the center. So we're going to continue to see these gusty winds tonight, and as this low moves off to the north-northwest, we'll probably see the winds start to become a little bit more of an east-northeast or even a northeast flow as time goes on. So when we get counterclockwise rotation around these lows, by tomorrow morning, we'll probably be seeing a pretty steepened gradient on a southeast flow as this low is approaching the coastline. So we'll have to watch for that. If we look at the GRE on radar, let's take a quick look at what's going on. You can catch the last frames of the visible satellite before the sun went down of where this center is, and it looks like the center is now exposed as some of this drier air that was to its west is wrapped up and around into the system. Also, a stability factor is some of these cooler shelf waters. You can see the topographical feature here down in the water called the Charleston Bump, and just west of the Charleston Bump, in between the coastline and the Gulf Stream, is a zone of cooler shelf waters, which are sitting at about 75 to 77 degrees. So we have cooler shelf waters helping to stabilize or bring in some cooler air to the surface of the storm, surface low pressure. And then we also have this drier air that is wrapped up and around the system. And this could be the trend for this storm as we go into tomorrow. We do have an upper trough that's still pulling up over the system. It was supposed to be off here to the east, but in fact it has pulled up and around, so it's actually creating upper level shear and ripping the cloud tops off and keeping most of that moisture to the northwest quadrant, or the northerly quadrant now of the storm. So it's making for a tricky forecast as far as what rains are going to do. We ended up getting some pretty heavy rains. We're still seeing that right now. In fact, if we look at the level 2 radar, we can get an idea of some of that swathing going on over the Charleston area. We're still seeing some heavy downpours making its way. Some of this area right here, some more moisture training into the coastline, and we'll continue to see these pockets of moisture all night long. Some of them could be kind of heavy at times with some embedded thunderstorms, so don't be surprised to see some lightning or hear some thunder through the overnight hours as these isolated cells make their way onto the coastline. So with that said, when you go back to the GRE and talk about some of this drier air, this moisture coming from the Gulf Stream looks like some of the convection from the Gulf Stream is helping fuel some of the cells coming into the coastline. We could continue to see this overnight and all the way into tomorrow morning. I'm not saying that everything's going to dry out around the storm, but I do think as this storm does head towards the north-northwest into land, that we'll see a less moisture, or a weaker moisture profile with it. Especially once it moves into land, there won't be a whole lot of moisture to pull from, and it'll be wrap around from the land, and then we'll have a little bit of onshore flow from the Atlantic coming in. So that alone could spark a few thunderstorms in the morning time, but not looking at too much once it does make landfall. Let's take a look at numerical model predictions. First thing is the tracks. So we still have some agreement and we have some disagreement. The immediate agreement is that the storm will drift off to the northwest and north-northwest and ultimately come close to or into the South Carolina coast. Where the disagreement is begins is when it does make contact with the land or close contact, where it's going to go. Some of the models do pull it off to the northeast, some of the models pull it to the north, and some models actually keep it to the south. The GFS has been on this since day one, keeping the system to the south, and that has a lot to do with a high pressure ridge that is going to be building up in the Appalachian Mountains here. We have Bermuda high pressure out here steering this storm up in this direction, and then we have an Appalachian high pressure ridge, or just a ridge building, that is keeping it suppressed to the south, and that's why it's stalled right now, because there isn't a lot of movement between these two ridges, and we have an upper trough pulling this way, and the storm is just sort of sitting in limbo until it gets a nudge from this high pressure as it builds out to the east. So that's kind of why it's stuck in its position right now, and the guidance is for it to slowly move to the north-northwest. So these tracks could take a little bit longer in time, because the system may actually stall a little bit longer than what they're showing as a solution. So if you look at the intensity pages, or the intensity guidance, most of the intensity models do bring it down in time. However, we still have some that maintain, and these models that maintain it actually keep the storm offshore. So if we look back at the tracks, we see some of these track guidance models keeping the storm come right up towards the coastline and then back offshore. So this is still a possibility that it could stay over the water and actually gain some momentum as it heads off to the northeast towards and takes a good swipe at southeast North Carolina. So these intensity models are holding on to that. We have one which is the Canadian 12-hour model. This is the SHIPS, which is the statistical hurricane prediction. We have the LGIM, that's an ensemble of the SHIP models, and then we have this one which is decay rate. I'm sorry, this is the decay rate. This is also the hurricane forecast 3-day model. So we have 4 models here that agree to keeping the storm off the coastline, over the water, and actually intensifying it. So we're not quite out of that yet. That's still very much a possibility. We have to pay attention to everything at this point with the system, especially since it's stationary and sitting over the Gulf Stream. Anything could happen. The general guidance is for it to move into the coast, but we'll have to wait and see what happens. We'll have a better picture of what's going to happen tomorrow morning. So let's take a look at the numerical modeling, and here's the GFS. Let me go to the, I'm sorry, this is the actual right one here. So I want to go back to 6 hours. This is GFS, brings it into the coast, and then it sort of sits, and you notice this high pressure here in the Appalachian Mountains, or the Appalachian Ridge, keeping that suppressed. And so this is what the GFS has been showing for days now as the solution to keep the storm hugged into the coastline. It was a little further south before, and then once that ridge builds back to the west or weakens to the west, it allows for that storm or the low to sort of move up the coastline around the Bermuda High out to the east. So that's what the GFS is still showing after all this time. Let's take a quick look at the Euro, see what the Euro is showing, and go back to 0 hours. This one's probably going to be pulling it off to the northeast a little bit quicker, but we do see that the Euro does bring it in by Sunday morning 7 a.m. It's coming into the coastline, and then it's just barely hugging it. This goes all the way through Sunday. The Euro keeps it along the coast all day Sunday and even into Monday morning, and then keeps it just off the coastline. So the Euro is starting to agree with this storm actually remaining over the water, or the central low pressure remaining over the water, which means it could stay intensified for just a little while longer, or keep the name for that matter. So if we look at mesoscale, I always want to check this out for rain potentials for the HRR 3 kilometer, and I'm going to go into the southeast region here and look at what the rain potentials are for the next 15 hours. This model does pretty well with precipitation, and actually it nailed it today. It said that we were going to get hit by the first bands of showers around 1 o'clock, and it was about 30 to 45 minutes earlier than that, but it was very, very close in its prediction. So let's take a look at the HRR 3 kilometer for the precip reading, and here we go. The HRR keeps it to the south of Charleston as well, and brings it to the north, and then over time into tomorrow morning, it actually brings this low right into Charleston, or brings Tropical Storm Bonnie right into Charleston. So you can kind of get an idea of what the rains are going to do. Looks like they start to taper off as soon as it makes contact with the land. You can see it's dry around the core at this point from some of that drier air still wrapping around from the south. This will keep a southeast flow, or maybe even switch to a southwest wind behind it. So it always gets really tricky when you get into wind forecasting for these systems, because everything's going tightly around the center, and then it's banding out in a wider berth around it as it grows in strength. And this one's not growing very wide in its wind field. So what we're going to have is going to be very tricky. We could either have a southeast wind, or we could have a southwest wind, or we could even have a westerly wind building in behind the south or southwest quadrant of this low as it moves in, depending on the track it does take. So I think that pretty much is it. I don't have very much else for the tropical analysis. I think that we're just going to have to watch for its movement ultimately to the north-northwest, whether or not it stalls along the coast and stays over water, or pushes inland and then lifts out to the northeast. There isn't a whole lot of steering going on at this point. It's really all being steered by the two ridges, the Bermuda High and the Appalachian. So if the Appalachian Ridge decays, it'll allow it to move up the coastline. But until then, we're just going to keep watching, and we'll see what it looks like tomorrow morning. But and I'll come back on for another tropics update if needed. Until then, thanks for watching.